to shut off your Wi-Fi that isn't interrupted, although the Wi-Fi should not have bandwidth issues this time of year. So I'm just going to give a kind of a very general overview of kind of the synoptic patterns and players that are involved. And then I'm going to hand it off to Matt, Daniel, Tyler, and Minghao, sitting over there, to talk about the forecast and therefore to avoid kind of being in the line of fire in terms of making snowfall predictions and all that. So in terms of the satellite, it's a water vapor satellite. We see that we have digging trough on the lid of the Rockies right now. You can see it's basically a strong diving jet stream to the south. Also sort of over Canada, we see sort of the broad signature of the southern half of a very large vortex centered over Hudson Bay. And then we also have pretty pronounced sort of to the west of the trough, pretty pronounced ridging as this next storm is getting ready to enter the Pacific Northwest. So really in terms of the synoptic players, it's the southern stream trough, which we usually look for in our big, historically large northeast storm, snowstorm events. It's sort of phasing of troughs, and certainly we have sort of one southern stream trough here, and also sort of on sort of broader scale, this larger long wave trough, we have these individual sort of short waves that are kind of rotating like spokes around a bicycle wheel, and kind of the timing and alignment and how these two vorticity areas of vorticity phase is really important for determining sort of the mode of cyclogenesis and how the cyclone looks, and also how much snow we get and sensible mass. So I'm going to kind of go back in time to, is this 15 and 16-1 for us over here?
Yeah.
Okay, using Alicia Bentley's maps. So showing the jet structure on this side and thickness, and the DT and low level vorticity on the right-hand side. So this is back about, let's see, what date is this? January 9th. So the Pacific has been, there's some talk about this huge cyclone, this bomb that occurred over the north central Pacific. So if you go forward, start going forward a little bit, you can see the evolution of this very intense cyclone basically encompassing the entire North Pacific, kind of leading to this elongated east to west oriented baroclinic zone, and associated with that, a very elongated and strong zone of jet structure over the Pacific. I'm sure maybe in future map discussions we'll talk more about this later. I know Andrew might have some stuff to say. But kind of interest as we sort of go forward in time, so we now go forward to about 3 days prior, about 72 hours prior, focusing on the jet exit region and the poleward exit region of this Pacific jet. We see cyclogenesis taking place, and as it does so, now going forward to the time that it makes approaches the west coast, we see that it undergoes, at least if we go back to the DT, if we go back just a couple frames here. So as it undergoes cyclogenesis, we see that it undergoes a cyclonic wave break. So we see sort of the high PV to the north, the low PV folding underneath it. And that had resulted in a large precipitation event over California. So it's now switching to the North American view from the Pacific view. So here we have the storm here again, strong jet to jet exit region, a cyclone on the poleward exit side of the jet. So going forward, the current time, we'll just stop right there actually. We see that this sort of disturbance gets deformed as it undergoes cyclonic wave break. Sort of the main portion goes here, but sort of the high PV gets elongated as it dives, as this ridge builds, and the jet forms sort of on the poleward side of this ridge building event, So we get the high PV sort of streaming down into the Rocky Mountain region. So go forward a little bit more. And that sort of results in the formation of that trough that we saw in the water vapor imagery. In part because of this ridge building out ahead of this cyclone that we also saw in the water vapor imagery, causing this ridge to build, and as a result, sort of the jet structure to then become more meridional-oriented, strong jets sort of on the backside of this trough, sort of helping to dig and result in hot falls on the southern side of the trough right there. So that results in the formation of that trough that we see currently exiting the Rocky Mountains. Brian Colley had some really interesting posts sort of related to sort of the evolution of this southern stream disturbance and how there was a lot of sensitivity sort of back here, especially with the structure of the diabatic ridge building effects and how that sort of would affect the evolution and depth and the progression of that trough. So it could be something that we could sort of look at sort of in the future as well. We do a retrospective of sort of what will eventually happen. Obviously, we don't know what was going to happen exactly yet. Okay, so the other thing I'll notice before I kind of hand it off to the graduate students is that here we see sort of big reservoir, high potential vorticity air associated with that vortex centered over Hudson Bay. But the DT really shows very nicely these spokes of higher PV that are associated with these tropopause, TPVs, tropopause polar vortices, right, if I'm getting that correct. So we see one, this is sort of analysis time this morning, we see one just north of the Great Lakes. The one of interest, though, that's relevant for what we're going to be looking at as in regards to the phasing of the storm is sort of this piece over here, this extra lobe here, and this high reservoir PBS sort of rotates around. So going forward about 24 hours now, you can see this trough as it continues to dig out into the southern plains of southeast US, begins to partially phase with that lobe that is rotated around the broader vortex. This southern stream disturbance starts to get deformed as we sort of have the continuous sort of progression of the ridge sort of pushing the trough this way, and you have the air rotational flow from the diabatic heating out ahead of the trough sort of pushing the southern portion this way. So the tendency is to contract the wavelength, but also tilt this trough such that it starts becoming more positively tilted. So as that happens, it tends to, the troughs don't quite phase completely, and the result, if we go forward maybe one or two more frames, is kind of this elongated and positively tilted trough that results in a lot of deformation out ahead of the trough itself. So even though there's a tendency to sort of, at least early on especially, where you have sort of this coherent PV block to induce cyclogenesis, because you have all that deformation on the front side of the trough, you're not getting really sort of continuously strong deepening of a compact low like we oftentimes see with a northeast snowstorm. Instead, you get this very elongated baroclinic zone with a cyclone that's sort of running along the baroclinic zone, but isn't sort of intensifying quickly. So in terms of kind of when we look at, again, back in the past at storms that have produced big northeast snowstorms, this is a little bit unusual, and I was talking to Ross a little bit about this, about how kind of the structure of the storm is kind of more resembling a frontal wave kind of later in the process compared to kind of a really big nor'easter with a big cyclone. So that has implications, obviously, on the precipitation type and where the snow will fall. Yes, Ross?
I wonder, and I think it's a minor rule, but I'm intrigued. It may not really have much to do at all with this development, but if you back up maybe 24 hours in the tropopause, there's a really impressive kind of broad region of low PV or elevated tropopause and associated with a ridge in the subtropical jet over the Gulf and
right. So over here,
Northwest Atlantic. Yeah. And so it's interesting because it sets up sort of you have sort of the Arctic trough, the polar trough, and a subtropical trough all sort of in unison, and that almost makes it helps make it more of an elongated frontal wave.
Right.
in a way.
That's a good point.
And it also maybe enhances the curvature as that shear vorticity downstream of the western ridge balls up at the base of the trough. So I don't know if it's a huge role, but you can definitely see the subtropical jet in association with the northern edge of that pool of low PV.
Andrew, would you call this one of your quasi-jet superposition tests?
Yeah, I think just from the basic evolution of what Brian described, it almost looks like the subtropical dominant category, at least in terms of where you have the cyclone almost driving the formation of a strong jet along sort of where the warm front would be oriented with the storm itself, and then you have the sort of the TPV there that stitches itself on the poleward side of the jet structure itself too. And in a lot of those cases, it's the cyclone precedes the superposition, as opposed to in some more of the polar dominant type cases where you end up with the superposition more at lower latitudes. You see the cyclone more as a response to the superposition, and then it takes on a little bit more maybe your classical nor'easter type situation. But that's exactly sort of what I was thinking looking at this particular evolution, is it sort of fits that mold really well. And maybe to add one more point onto what Ross mentioned too, not only in terms of the dynamics you talked about, Ross, but the fact you're bringing sort of that elevated tropopause so far north, you're creating a sort of a thermodynamic environment that's essentially subtropical or tropical in the vicinity of where this is developing too. So in terms of the amount of moisture available, or just having a favorable sort of thermodynamic environment, you put that in there just by having, let's say, that sort of tri-alignment of troughs.
Okay, so let's go to the more mesoscale and specific details of the storm. I'll let the students take over.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention a few of this is still a little bit more on the synoptic scale, but just looking at some of the latest trends in the GFS and how they relate to the surface cyclone. So on the left here, we've got the surface fields and precip fields. And on the right, we have the 250 millibar wind speeds. And as we bring this forward a little bit, we'll note if we stop it at 0Z tomorrow night, we'll notice some fairly strong upper level divergence right in the mid-Atlantic area, associated with the strong jet streak to the north and the more subtropical jet streak to the south. And where we have this divergence aloft is where we're getting the low to form at the surface, running up into Kentucky and West Virginia. So if you go to a model trend loop and just go back a few runs on the GFS, you'll notice some changes since 18Z yesterday. So this is from 18Z yesterday, and we just compare the couple from yesterday versus the one today. You notice there's a lot more divergence with the the subtropical jet streak becoming a little more south on today's runs, and a little bit more ridging loft, and a stronger and further north jet streak, which sort of tends to amplify the entire system, and you're getting a stronger and slightly slower low back more to Kentucky versus a couple days ago, or at 18Z yesterday when it was up in southwest PA. And if we can change to, on this slide, 500 millibar vorticity, there's some changes there that also affect some of the aspects of the cyclone. So this is the 12Z run today. And if we compare this to just a few runs ago, you'll notice that, first of all, this northern shortwave, it's a little bit further back. It's a little bit further back on the 12Z run today compared to where it is now. And the ridging back here is slightly further west as well. So as Brian was mentioning, that has a little bit to do with the shape of the southern shortwave and the vorticity there. Whereas compared to yesterday, the 12Z runs today from the GFS isn't quite stringing the vorticity out quite as much. It's not as much possibly tilted, it's more neutrally tilted. And that has to do with a slightly slower and further west low position. And it allows moisture and everything, as we'll mention a little bit, to get a little bit further north in here. And one more thing, with the vorticity a little bit more consolidated, with the 12Z run compared to yesterday. That also allows for a little bit more of a consolidated low and a little bit more traditional cyclone compared to some of the runs that, as Brian has mentioned, have a really strung out vorticity. And then I'll give it over so we can talk about some of the more mesoscale features with temperature and everything.
So if you go to the web page, I have put several diffractive key loops of the European forecast. So if you refresh, yeah, click on the EC MSLP at 2012Z, maybe 1 on the left and 2018Z on the right. Yeah. So that's from the European deterministic forecast initialized between 12Z 16th to 12Z today. Maybe you can just go exit that page and then go into that page again in order to see the loop. So the surface cyclone is actually, at the same time, it's actually chaining towards the northeast more. So before the northern stream and the southern stream phase, it's chaining towards less phasing so that the southern stream moves slower. But if you go 12 hours forward in time, then the southern stream is more like rotating around the northern stream instead of phasing completely. So the cyclone is moving slower, getting more consolidated as it moves towards the northeast. But once it gets past one point, it's moving faster and more further away towards the northeast. And as a result of this, we're seeing the QPF distribution further to the north in the recent European runs. So if you click on the QPF from the ensemble mean from the European runs, so it's actually trending towards a slightly eastward shift and less QPF over Albany, which is not good. But this is a global model, and actually the land has been shifting north and south both ways in recent runs, so we're still waiting to see what will act out. So in terms of how the upper level phases and how the lower level surface low, the shape of the surface low is, along with how these QPF is located, determines how much snow we can get. And then we also have a property key map for 850 temperature, and we can see that it's actually trending a little bit warmer for Albany in the past 3 or 4 runs, except one very cold run initialized at 0Z on the 17th. The other runs are all trending warmer, with the northern edge of freezing line on the 850 millibar level right south of Albany. So the sleet front may push into the southern Albany County at some point earlier on Sunday. That's the trend from the European model again. Yeah. So maybe I'll hand it over to Matt Campbell to talk about some of the banding features in the models and how favorable it is for Albany getting snow.
Another one of the interesting aspects with this storm is that we could actually, or somewhere in the capital region, even, or perhaps north of the capital region, could see some very efficient snowfall rates. And a lot of this is going to be associated with frontogenesis, associated with the warm front coming north as we go forward. So here, let's go back to 0Z on Sunday, and then also pull up the sounding for Albany at 0Z at the same time. Click and then go to KALB. All right, so this is the samples, the 3K NAMP sounding. This was initialized, I believe, at 12Z today, the model run from today. And right now you can see it's very cold at the surface. And we have a lot of frontogenesis going on, but it's still well south and west of the capital region. But what we're going to start to see is strong vertical motion through the entire dendritic growth zone as we go forward. So as we go forward, we can see the frontogenesis approaching, which will help support rising motion. And then you can see on the sounding here, our dendritic growth zone basically extends all the way almost from the surface all the way up through 650 millibars. So you're lifting a saturated layer through a dendritic growth zone, really cold air. So we can see some very high liquid water to snow ratios. The National Weather Service right now around the capital region was going upwards of 14 to 1, so 14 inches of snow for 1 inch of liquid water equivalent. So wherever this frontogenesis sets up associated with this type of thermal profile could see pretty efficient snowfall rates, and everything should stick on the surface since we're so cold. So it just is going to really depend where this sets up. And just to show the structure, you can see this is at 850 hectopascals, but if you go to 700 hectopascals, you can see the frontogenesis is, as you would expect, farther north of that frontogenesis region at 850 hectopascal. But essentially, wherever this sets up, and I think Tyler will talk about that, could see some, again, this is why the snowfall rates are going to be very important for this, but they could be very high in a certain region somewhere in here, wherever that sets up, and whether that's going to be north, south, the capital region is going to depend a lot on the impacts. Yeah.
Can you take a cross section here?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it. I don't know if it's going to be both a cross section or a sound.
How do you do
Hold
it?
control.
Control. Okay.
Alright. You can see that coming up through capital region. So I think Tyler wants to talk about more specifically where this may set up, and that'll have a big implication on who gets the highest snowfall totals in this storm.
Yeah, so one of the interesting features about this storm is that for the most part we saw, looking at those deep probability key features, that the synoptic scale has really been, set up pretty well. There hasn't been too much oscillation either way. So we're pretty certain about that, and now it really comes down to looking at the mesoscale features in the system. So if you want to just go through, Matt, if you can just kind of loop through the 3K NAM. So since about 0Z last night, the 12K and the 3K NAM have both been hinting that there could be some serious banding across the capital region and points to the north and west, depending, again, as Matt was saying, on where the frontogenetical forcing really occurs. And that's going to have a huge implication on the exact totals. But if we look at, discussion of about a 14 to 1 snow to liquid ratio, as well as about 1.3, 1.4 QPF, we could be talking upwards of 18, 20 inches out of the system, and it really depends on localized forcing and where that sets up. So it's going to be really interesting just kind of looking at further model runs and seeing as this system approaches what exactly occurs. And then I think from here we just kind of wanted to turn it over to any questions, any predictions, anything anyone wants to say.
I have a question about the banding in the mesoscale operational models. If the mesoscale models have banding, does it make it much more likely that there's banding in the real storm? Or is there not really a relationship between the two? Plus, I guess the question is, what is banding exactly, too? In other words, that figure you showed, why would we call that banding?
Which one?
Just the last one that was up there.
The reflex, or the sort of model.
The model precept.
The model precept.
Oh,
So I guess the banding in that case would be across Connecticut and southeastern New York, but then there's also a region. I guess I've seen clearer banding in models than this.
Right, I mean over like Ohio and there's a little bit more.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think in general, the high-res models have a tough time with the location and the nature of these really nice mesoscale bands. And in some cases, there's translational bands that move into more of a stationary band. One thing we could look at would be some of James Kenyon's work in terms of the mesoscale band type, because he created 3 nice conceptual diagrams of mesoscale band type, and I think this one fits pretty nicely into one, which maybe we can pull up in a minute.
Right, I think the schematic, we could have a schematic or look at, I mean, the Q vectors is really what James's work was sort of predicated on. I also have an email from the chat group about whether anybody wants to say anything about the CSI associated with the potential banding. Maybe not.
Tough to calculate.
I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned yet is, you know, we're in Albany and it's snowy here, but just looking at the southeast, or the mid-Atlantic and southeast, and the severe weather potential that is sort of developing associated with this, it looks like there's a pretty good squall line that develops.
Yeah, I think that's one thing we haven't been paying as much attention to is the other risk types. You know, when Albany hears we get snow, we get a little crazy and go for whatever model run says we get snow, but myself included. But yeah, I think that brings up a good point of the different severe weather types that we could see. You know, obviously there's going to be a lot of sleeting with so much low-level cold air, but there's also, you know, the threat for some really severe freezing rain event in maybe some localized areas where there's stronger warm air advection with still the surface cool. So, you know, it's a pretty wide swath of the country that has to be alert for different types of risk.
One thing I'll mention on that point, this isn't on your point, Andre, I'm sorry, but on the point that you just mentioned about the freezing rain / sleet, I was talking with Nick and Brian a little bit earlier, and to me this is an interesting case. If you put up, sorry I have you jumping around so much here, but if you put up the GFS next to the 3-kilometer NAM at the same time, and you look at the precipitation type algorithm that's displayed here, yeah, perfect time, 12Z Sunday. So there are, as was pointed out to me, and Nick pointed this out, but there are pretty marked differences in the position of the front, but yeah, the camera, you can show the camera in front there so they can see it there. And you can, there's definitely pretty significant differences, like at least like 150-kilometer differences in the position of the front between these two models. But the GFS has rain all the way south and all the way north into southern New Hampshire. And to me, with such a strong pressure gradient and a relatively cold air mass that's coming in place after today's weather system, I just can't see how there's going to be rainfall that far north. I think the GFS is out to lunch in its representation of the surface cold air, and the scouring out of that cold air is just not going to be that significant. So I think there's probably going to be a pretty wide swath of mixing. Sorry? Yeah. What? Yeah. But maybe it's going to be somewhere in between these two, but I would side more with the NAM on precip type here than with the GFS.
Ross, if you look at the gaps forecast, there are some members that are far west and real taking an inland track of the storm, and that's what's associated with that surge of warm air.
Oh, with the storm.
Yeah, they have the storm further west.
Yeah,
and that's been consistent for the last several GFS runs.
Yeah, if you were to click on southern New Hampshire there, yeah, it's sounding right to the GFS, perfect. And synoptically it's different than the NAM, so it's not going to be a great comparison, but I mean, with north of the front sort of easterly float surface, I just have a hard time seeing it's going to get as warm as 35 there, with heavy precipitation falling at 12Z tomorrow, Sunday morning. So, I mean, that just seems crazy to me.
Have there been studies that show maybe GFS is bad with cold air damming and representing the boundary layer during these kind of situations?
I think
Pretty good example of that last year.
Remember the
March 2nd.
March 2nd.
But that, I think, was like a precip type right around Albany. This is, I feel like, is much more widespread.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Like the other one, I have a suspicion that has something to do with how the boundary layer scheme is set up. This looks more like terrain. It's just not handling cold air damming very well.
Yeah, and this is saturated all the way to the surface, whereas that March 3rd case, or March 2nd case last year have this bizarre deep mixed layer with them.
Right, exactly.
I mean, the surface low ought to track along coastal front, which is clearly going to form in there, and that's going to be the axis along which the low tracks. And to the north of that, there'll be a northerly component of the wind. I don't care what the forecast is. There's going to be a northerly component of the wind, and it's going to be very cold at the surface.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting that the GFS surface low track might be too far inland because it's moving the surface front too
level
far?
winds are easterly, whereas in the NOM they're northeasterly, so it's not getting colder down very well.
So the FE3 has a similar tracks to regular GFS, but it has more widespread sleet and freezing rain. It has an actual transition as opposed to just rain to heavy snow.
So it must be colder in the boundary layer.
Yeah, it's probably representing the surface at least a little bit more, but it still kind of floods 850 with more.
It still looks a little.
It's still kind of even there, maybe not too representative of.
Now see, here's the big difference between the European solution, which is further out to the east, and the GFS, which has been insisting on basically a coastal hugger.
So Mike Evans at the National Weather Service was commenting on that it might be hard to really get more than 16, 18 inches anywhere because it's sort of an open system rather than a closed system at 500 millibars. And that may be lacking some of the deformation that would come along with that. And so there's been some discussion about this open versus a closed system at 500 millibars where that's what the Weather Service seems to be keeping the numbers down because of something like that.
Can we pull up some of James Kenyon's stuff?
Yeah.
Well, because it's an open wave, there's no wraparound warm advection coming around, so you don't see a lot of precip on the west side of the storm in the forecast.
Right. But do we know have a sense of what the P-Watt anomalies are for this? Because my understanding was that they were pretty darn high.
Can you put up to normalized?
Yeah.
Are you sure? Someone has them.
Yeah, try to
Ross, if you do a Google search, it pops up.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
/web.
P-Watt standardized anomaly.
Thank you, sorry. It works, might be on the...
Is Tomer alive?
No, but we've got Mansour though from.
Got it. There we go. Yeah.
So it's looking like, what, 2.5, 3 sigma into like Connecticut, Rhode Island. So it's pretty anomalous.
I mean, it's decent. I mean, we have a positive 1 sigma anomaly here, and our surface temperatures are 15 degrees.
Yeah.
It's not bad.
So they're also up from the chat. Mansour is asking about the EC ensembles in terms of the spatial variability at the low center. He also wants to know about the Icelandic wind keeping the rain snow line south relative to the forecast. I'm going to say he got that from 400 because I took.
Yeah, Icelandic wind is in the solution of the model, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But if it's not, if the low's not developing sort of fast enough in the model, or
Yeah.
Because it's not super deep.
Yeah, it's not super deep on.
Pretty steady, right?
Yeah, Matt was just saying the Icelandic wind may not be a huge factor because it's not like a bomb.
a rapid, yeah, I would agree.
Bombing out, yeah.
Yeah.
That is true.
While you're loading that too, on the left you can see those are the 3 primary conceptual diagrams of mesoscale snowbands. In green is the 8-layer average 850 to 700 millibar frontogenesis and the 3 synoptic scale patterns.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
this
so-
one, yes. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, sorry. You go.
No, I was just saying. So kind of related to Mike Evans' point in terms of a closed mid/upper level load. This isn't quite quite the pivoting band conceptual diagram. We don't have a.
Not at all. It's laterally quasi.
It's definitely the laterally quasi.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's definitely the laterally quasi-stationary band. And we want to, Albany wants to be right where that green X is there.
We are.
Yeah. So in terms of, if you sort of compare, what's the green here? The green's temperature.
Sometimes
Yeah,
just
temperature. Okay, so I mean, relative to kind of this conceptual diagram with the flow vectors and thickness, but you can sort of treat that more or less, similar in that regard with regards to the green dash vectors here. You see that we have sort of confluent flow, right, and then sort of the orientation of the thickness lines or the isotherms are in such this way, and then the Q vectors are pointed generally. I mean, they're rotated a little bit, but they resemble most closely this laterally quasi-stationary band.
They should be, frontogenetically configured, pointing towards the warm air.
Right, right. So back here, it's more back here, I would say, that it resembles the laterally quasi-stationary band. So there is, the models do hint at a sort of secondary snowband.
Can we do a bunch of control pluses and zoom in?
Well, I think you can get a different view.
You can go to the northeast,
or
but it was a little bit,
even better.
yeah, it was a little bit too zoomed in. Can you go to the northeast view?
See how it looks.
Oh, that. Oh. Where is Tomer Wing?
Yeah. Get him on the phone. But it'll be interesting with.
Oh, there we go.
Go for, yeah. So up here, it resembles more the laterally translating band. We see sort of that northward progression from the genesis out ahead of the wave. So the initial band looks more like the laterally translating band. Sort of with the, if you maybe go back one more. Yeah, over here, as sort of the snow sort of breaks out over. Yeah. So in terms of sort of the initial burst, it's this laterally translating band, but the band may then get sort of stuck sort of up here.
What time were we seeing before from the zoomed out version?
The time, sorry?
We changed something here. This is what time?
Yeah, we backed up 12 hours from what we were looking at earlier.
Right.
So the idea being that first you have.
They go forward, and now it looks like that laterally.
That's what we were seeing before.
Yeah.
You get the Q vectors with a pronounced pointing towards the warm air.
Right.
Strong,
So they're
strong frontogenesis.
Right. So there's probably going to be a secondary band back here that's sort of translating.
Right, and I think you saw that in the.
In the 3 kilometer, at a solution. So in terms of the sort of the conceptual diagrams, there's signature for these two bands to form during the evolution. Sort of initially the laterally translating band and then the laterally quasi-stationary band. But where that occurs is tricky.
But I guess to bring this into a forecasting perspective, I guess if we can match this up to the composite of a laterally quasi-stationary band, then we can up our chances for potentially higher snowfall totals than what we might think with just an open system.
Oh, right, right.
So seeing this composite for a laterally quasi-stationary band may help to offset the fact that this isn't a closed system.
Right. And also, you can look at the laterally quasi-stationary band almost in the sense of training. That that band can set up over an area and live, and the residence time can be long, and elements can keep moving through it. So you start thinking if you can get snowfall rates of say 1 to 2 inches per hour, you go to the upper end. You can get we can get 8 hours. It gives us 16 inches.
So I know we all love snow, but we have a question here about the potential for flooding in the DC area, considering the snow that they've had and that's still on the ground and saturated soil.
I guess we can look at that briefly. I didn't look. I'm always magnifying glasses over. So yeah, let's stick to the 3 kilometer and then see. I mean, certainly with anomalous precipitant water and the baroclinic zone staying right there in the trough, sort of the QG forcing with the lift, certainly there's a possibility of heavy rain falling over a long duration and over that region. So you get the initial warm advection that we were getting here, right? And they break out into the warm sector. But it seems to move through pretty quickly.
Right. Because without the wraparound.
Yeah.
Precipitation.
There's a pretty quick shut off to the. I mean, it gets so cold behind the. I mean, once the front moves through, you lose all your moisture.
Right. So you get flash freezing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It could be a big flash freeze for areas that see heavy rain.
Better flooding potential looks to be maybe next week if the European from 12Z verifies.
We shouldn't even touch that right now.
Next week.
Next week, yeah.
The proverbial next one, Steve Carucci used to say.
Right. Yeah. Everyone's already shifted their attention to the 300-hour forecast. You see, this one's out news already.
Before we go to the later next week, does your cross section still alive or did it get away?
Yeah. We can pull it back up.
I'm not sure what time it was, but I'm curious, there was a question about CSI or sometimes just I couldn't tell what all the embroidery was.
Yeah, go to take a cross section maybe around
60.
Yeah, 60.
I'd make it maybe a little longer than the one you did last time.
Go, I think northwest to southeast, across the band.
Right.
Oh.
Do that.
There we go.
You probably want U right in that plane.
What are the
you want some measure of the shear.
What are the fields that are being shown? What's the gray?
The gray is omega.
Motion.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So before we move on, sort of the signature of banding is where you looked at an intersection of the dendritic growth zone with the highest omega. This is where you get those big aggregate snowflakes.
Yeah,
so banding as we observe it on radar is a signature of big aggregates. So in terms of the problem with looking at sort of a model output is that it's just precipitation rate, right? So in terms of the different types of snow, crystals and all that one can get, I mean, radar will differentiate, but that the model doesn't have all those various sort of, as far as I know, Justin maybe with the comment. Those microphysics teams don't differentiate between different snow crystals.
Not the habit aspects.
Yeah, exactly. So the model itself, when we look at simulated relativity, isn't able to see that. So
it's dramatically, look at the frontogenesis, presumably those
sloping
slope frontal zone here,
and it's very
strong frontogenesis along it.
So likely there's very strong slantwise ascent in the above the front,
right?
And that's very conducive to heavy snow. The other question is, as far as I guess CSI or whatever, can you show potential vorticity or saturation equivalent potential vorticity, or no choice on that? Is it hard?
There's a thing at the bottom where you can.
At the bottom, right.
That's what to look for. It should be close to zero.
It's got PV.
PV. Yep.
Which kind does it have?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's all it shows.
It's not saturated.
It's dry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We need the saturated one to really be sure.
Don't ask Tom about it, please.
And then
don't ask Tom. Is he listening?
No, I'm listening.
Went out of the page.
Did he leave a cow in this?
Yeah, it's tough to tell if there's a sort of
out of the page.
the necessary conditions for CSI.
Right.
Yeah,
very
you
hard.
can't-
Too hard. Saturation equivalent.
Carrie Manuel might be able to, but I can't.
No, the idea would be if saturation equivalent potential vorticity is close to zero, that's ideal.
Right.
You have, slantwise moist neutrality, and everything's right. But that previous plot with frontogenesis was very, very encouraging.
Right.
So
yeah,
we would bring the stratosphere and Andrea into this. That Mike Evans was noting that we had this big stratospheric warming event, and now in the 7 to 10 days, the ECMWF is looking cold and stormy. Nick Schiraldi was also commenting on the system for mid next week and the run-to-run variability with that, and sort of if this ties back to the event we just had.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion in the stratosphere community about the sudden stratospheric warming, and the sudden stratospheric warming happened just after Christmas, so between Christmas and New Year's. And the stratospheric vortex split in two. It was a wave 2 warming event, and the signature has remained in the stratosphere and hasn't really reached the troposphere as it typically does. So there's been a lot of discussion as to why, and some of that discussion, was going on at the Middle Atmosphere Committee or the Middle Atmosphere meeting at EMS last week. But now it's looking like the signal is finally coming down, and it is associated with a lot of the things that we're seeing. So cold in Europe currently, a lot of snowfall in places that don't usually experience snowfall. And also now here in the US, we're having our polar vortex event of the year that we hear about every year. But yeah, so there is a connection, and it was a slow tropospheric response to the SSW, but it seems like this cold air outbreak that we're going to experience is associated with it. So yeah, hopefully, Lance, maybe there'll be more in that map discussion next week.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you say anything about the timing of that cold? In other words, this shift in pattern that we've apparently had that might be tied to this stratospheric thing. How long do those last?
So usually the ones that impact North America are more short-lived, on the order of a week or so, than what they experience in Europe. So yeah, ours will be more short-lived, but usually on the order of a week or slightly longer for the pattern. But spurts of extreme cold in there. So Monday.
You want to see the downward propagation that Andrea was talking about? That Hannah Attard sent me a link if you want to. So it's it's her page. So atmos.albany.edu/student/H Attard. ARD. ATT/plots.
You got it. And then /plot.
You need a www there.
Yeah. And then /plots.
Plots.
I don't think it's linked.
Yeah. Plots/Earth risk. Right. So then, Earth risk. Forecast.
Yep.
And then
Polar Cap GFS.
Yep. That one. Or she says you can also see it from Andrea's site as well, the coupling.
Oh, right.
So whatever one you want to talk about.
Yeah.
So the coupling
this, you can see in this, what you're looking at here is the standardized height anomalies from 60 poleward of 60 north. And so these are the polar cap geopotential height anomalies. And what you're looking at is from the surface all the way to 10 hectopascals, going back into for a month, and then the black line forward is the forecast. But what you can see is the sudden stratospheric warming that happened between Christmas and New Year's, and all of a sudden you see the geopotential height anomalies in the stratosphere exceed 2 sigma. And then we have this slow progression of these positive height anomalies going down into the lower stratosphere, and they've basically been hovering in the lower stratosphere, waiting for the troposphere to, receive them, if you will. So there's this communication that happens between the troposphere and stratosphere, and it doesn't happen all the time. So there's periods of time when the downward propagation signal actually extends into the troposphere, but we're about to go into that phasing. So, yeah. And I will add that it's known that models don't do this downward communication very well. So even though we see our forecasts out to 15 days, by the time we get to day 15, usually the signal is stronger than is usually resolved by a model like the GFS.
Yes.
I'd like to add a comment about the predictability issue on the longer time scale for some deep prod ETs that really show some interesting aspects of evolution in the last 8 or 9 days.
Do you want?
Yeah.
What would you like to show?
The dynamic tropopause. Yeah. There's a dynamic tropopause, northern hemisphere, North America view, I think, and then there's yeah, that looks right. And then there's North America would be better. There's a loop already, should be loaded in.
We didn't have that on the website yet.
Ah.
Yeah, we can bring it up here.
You want to go back as far as you can. I went back like 30 frames or thereabouts. I think I had it verifying 6Z on Sunday. Then we can call it 500 little heights afterwards. But if you look at that and loop it, going back, you see in the height field, which is implied in there, the forecast 7 or 8 days ahead of time had the right idea. If you were to smooth the large scale troughs and ridges, you have an outstanding forecast. The problem is in the day-to-day details of the smaller scale features in there. And particularly if you look at the deprogity of the jet at 250 there on the left, what's the first time period? It should help. How far back is that? It'll go back like 5, 8 or 7 or 8 days.
Yeah, initialized January 11th at 12.
Okay. So just watch the change of the structure of the cores of the jets. And even though the main large-scale troughs and ridges are approximately in the right places as you go through, you see the locations, the strength of the jets, and the changes in where the jet entrance and exit regions are. And those are where the most significant vertical motions are going to be found in those regions. So even though you have the large-scale features approximately right, it's these little shifts in the day-to-day details that really matter. And you can also see that there on the right screen in terms of the dynamic tropopause loop, in terms of the structure of the PV anomalies as they evolve with time. Look, for example, at the eastern trough, and also in the Pacific that Brian talked about at the beginning there. You can see the little cyclonic wave breaking in the Northeast Pacific, with a little breakaway disturbance down near Hawaii in there, PV tail. So you can see the ridge figure configuration changes and how those cold pools move down into North America really matters. And if we put up the 500 millibar height and vorticity, I think we have that one up there as well. And if you look early on, one of the things you see is the ridge. Yeah, see, you have a full latitude ridge in the early part of the period there. What's that forecast? That's one. I can't quite read it. What's that?
138.
138. There should be after one. Yeah, further. What's that?
So here's all the way back at 11.
That's 12 in the 11th. When you have a full latitude ridge, like you have in Western North America like that, I mean, basically the ridge in the west and the trough in the east shows up in throughout. But when you have a full latitude ridge like that, if you move forward, then you have a channel for cold air from the high Arctic and high northern Canada come down into central and eastern North America. But as you go through time, you'll see troughs break through and do the deprogity, and you see that it's not possible to hold that ridge completely in place. So you think things are cutting through the ridge there. See as we get closer in time? So that suggests that there'll be a limit to how much cold air will be around behind this storm, because with that lower amplitude, flatter ridge in the western part of the U.S., you effectively cut off the cold air supply from northern Canada. So that subtle difference in the ridge structure over the course of the deprogity really matters. So the question is whether it can reload in time. But
which is why
the extended cold here is always associated with a big ridge, full latitude ridge in the west, and you just Arctic air mass after Arctic air mass just keeps coming down into the Midwest and Northeast.
Which is why those forecasts for below zero temperatures for the AFC Championship game in Kansas City, those have gone out the wayside and they're left with like temperatures around 20 degrees.
Yeah.
Still Tom Brady weather.
So even though we got the long wave features right, and like 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have got the long wave features right. So this is a significant improvement in numerical weather prediction to get the long wave features correct. But that's the good news. The bad news is the details still matter. And you get, as you can see, you get a lot of flipping and flopping of where the jets are, entrance and exit regions are, and so on. And those are what control the weather.
I still find it remarkable that at 7 days out, people are already talking about a pretty high impact event on the East Coast.
We knew there was going to be a trough. We just didn't know the details.
And I know Nick posted stuff about it on Twitter, right, with the ensembles.
Yeah, just at the GEFS ensemble precip has been remarkably consistent in terms of its orientation and, I mean, even magnitude in terms of the ensemble mean. Obviously, as Lance mentioned, it's the exact positioning of the max precip has shifted a little bit, but the general details have been surprisingly consistent.
All this is a tribute to all the people who work in various aspects of numerical weather prediction around the world. This is maybe 50 years from now, people will look back and fully appreciate the achievement of numerical weather prediction over the last 50 years. But I don't think the people who pioneered this and are continuing the trend get enough credit for what they've done. Just phenomenal achievement.
Seems like that's pretty much the discussion. If we kind of want to transition into a little bit more of a forecasting contest, see what people think the end snowfall totals will be.
Okay, yeah, so before I did, I just want to mention there's, you know, in these times, right, when we're dealing with really high impact weather, there's the people sort of working behind the scenes at the Albany Weather Service, but also at all the weather service offices around the country and the national centers, and as Lance mentioned, the model developers. And it's important to acknowledge, especially since we do have weather service people watching, that you know, we all support what they're doing, and we really thank them for their efforts during this time, because you know, they're working without pay right now. You can only imagine sort of how stressful and how you know, terrible it is to have this uncertainty kind of hanging over you. So we really thank them for their dedication and hard work, sort of, and I know they have to be fully staffed this weekend because they have to deal with this high impact event. So while many of us get to, you know, sit at home and enjoy the snow from the comforts of our couch, we have people who are in the weather service offices working hard to issue warnings and things. So I want to just get that message out. Thank you. Okay, so now we can talk about snowfall.
Right. So here we have the WPC probabilistic tool. Right now we're looking at their 50th percentile of 72-hour snowfall accumulations. So right now it has Albany right at about 15 inches, right on the border between those two regions right here. And it seems to be hinting that the banding might set up a little bit to our north, and that might be the region, the hot spot of this snowstorm. Danny, if you want to toggle between, maybe go to the 25th, just to kind of capture some of the range. They put us right at about 12 inches just on the border again, and then 75th bumps us up into the, what is that, 18 to 21 range? So about 20 inches of snow there.
Yeah, 18 to 21.
Yeah.
This group is biased.
75th seems like
Can we look at the 99th percentile?
To be fair, we'll go to the 5th too.
Yeah, and then just looking at what National Weather Service Albany's put out, they've put up pretty similar numbers where I think they do 10th to 90th percentiles when they look at it, but they have low end around 8 inches, high end around 22, and expected right at 17, which has been more or less consistent throughout the past few days in their thinking of the range of possibilities here. So anyone else want to chime in with their numbers?
We can write everyone's forecast up on the board.
Right.
after we put the projectors up.
I know, Lance, you had, what, an over-under of 15 for the past
15 to
few days?
16 has been my over-under number.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I felt better about it when it started to dry out. I didn't feel so good about it, but I was going down with a sinking ship, all guns blazing. 15 and 16.
Seems like wherever like a really good stationary band sets up is gonna. That's the thing that's always hard to tell exactly. The high end could be really
Somebody's
high.
going to get 30 inches.
The 95th percentile will probably happen somewhere.
Some, yeah.
But probably not here.
It's not going to be too far from here. I don't think.
Yeah. Where do you think
problem is
it'll-
in the middle of the night? You know, that's
Mhm.
you can't enjoy it as much.
Any early predictions, Ross, where you think the band will really set up?
Hopefully over my house, but probably. Yeah, I feel like it maybe just so like a county west and north. I mean, I think like Saratoga may do really well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just maybe I'm just going on climatology from recent storms, but I think we're going to do quite well. But it's not a super long duration event. That's why we really rely on that banding setting up and being training over itself for a long period to get the really heavy amounts. But I also think the snowfall rates, I mean, I think they're going to be 4-inch an hour rates, pretty good bet at that region, within the region easily, I think. I mean, that's going to be really coming down.
Thunder snow?
Don't forget 4 inches per hour.
I think so,
I think part of the 4 inches per hour might be just due to the ratios themselves, but as opposed to like precip ratios, I could see maybe 0.1 inches per hour at least, maybe 0.2.
There is some MHC potential as well, Sunday afternoon here. If you look at the wind flow, as the low sort of pushes into the Gulf of Maine, there's confluent flow. So we could get I don't think we'll get to 6 inches that Lance saw that one time, but at his house. But it's good. It's usually good for another 1 or 2 inches, especially since it's so cold. The dendritic growth zone basically extends all the way to the surface at that point.
I guess the high resolution.
Those more likely to happen with a strong system or a frontal wave system?
I don't know. Given that this is kind of unusual, it'd be interesting to see. But the pressure pattern, if you just look at sea level pressure, you see the channel flow down in the valleys. Both it's minus 10 degrees Celsius over lowest 700 millibars. Trough is still off to our west, so there's a little bit forcing for ascent, and the low levels are pretty moist still. So all the ingredients are there.
You need to hang that trough.
Yeah.
To happen.
So some of them, like the NAM, I believe, had at least some signature or something, but transient, because the whole system is obviously moving really fast.
The 18Z NAM should be out by now.
Yeah. Watch, it just has sleep
Right.
all night now. It might not be out not far enough yet.
Little early.
Not far enough. Not far enough.
You pull up the 850 temperature and just look at the change from 12Z.
So a little colder.
Lowest south too.
Looks like
not quite as
it's a little warmer over the Midwest and Ohio and Indiana, but then a little colder up in our area.
It looks like even toward southwest Ohio, the cold air is a little bit. The cold air is farther north.
Right.
West, of course.
Yeah, and over New England, it looks like it's getting a little bit more cold air lower to the ground.
You
so actually-
zoom out to the eastern view and look at the 850 winds and heights. That oftentimes they give it a good indication, kind of upstream, whether
On the
water
right.
convection will make. Oh yeah, that works too. I believe there's like 850. You can look at 850 high wind or something somewhere, or MSLP and 850 wind. But that works.
What does this forecast verify?
This is at 20. This is at
19th Zero.
Yeah.
So which one's which? So it's slower.
Yeah, so a little bit.
12Z.
It's hard to say at this point. Slower probably means warmer solution for us then, I guess.
The NAM's been the cold side of the model, so it's the past 24 hours, right? So maybe the NAM is trending
going to be close. I think we might see, the precip lets up a little bit, and at times I think we might see a little bit of sleep.
Yeah, but when's the precip?
We're going to wake up.
That's very important.
We're going to wake up at 5 a.m. and you're going to hear the pinging on your window. It's just the most depressing sound ever.
Yeah. I think with the precip intensity and the fact that it's such a narrow little nose of warming, I think the intensity and the melting, any potential melting would take care of it, in Albany at least. Yeah. Unless there's a dramatic change in the track. Take one
Well, the ensembles, the GEFs has been persistently in the 20 to 25% range of ensemble members who bring the 850 line north of Albany in the run. So you can't, it's not a slam dunk that we won't change over.
Yeah.
All right, anything from the people online?
No, I think we've answered all their questions.
All right.
And now it's time to put our money where our mouth is.
Now it's time. Now it's time to raise the board, raise the screens, and put our numbers down.
We'll post those later. We'll post our forecasts in a separate tweet.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to our viewers.